Coming up next, Book TV presents Afterwards, an hour-long discussion between a guest host and the author of a new book. This week, Jack Matlock, ambassador to the Soviet Union under President Ronald Reagan, discusses his book, Superpower Illusions, How Myths and False Ideologies Led America Astray, and How to Return to Reality. In the book, Ambassador Matlock looks at the role played by Mikhail Gorbachev in bringing down the Soviet Empire, and argues that President Reagan's successors learned the wrong lessons from the end of the Cold War. He's interviewed by Dimitri Simes, president of the Nixon Center and publisher of the National Interest.
Ambassador Matlock, this is a very interesting and important book, Superpower Illusions. It's clearly also a very critical book as far as U.S. foreign policy is concerned, at least with the beginning of the Clinton administration and then, of course, the second Bush administration. You clearly disagree with the direction U.S. foreign policy took during this period. That's why I was particularly struck with the last sentence in the book. And the last sentence says, "I began in a mood close to despair, and in one of encouragement and hope. If the nation can face up to its mistakes and correct them, it will prove that the faith in America shared by Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama is not misplaced." Why are you more optimistic now?
Well, I'm still optimistic, though the last year, the months since I wrote that, have seen some setbacks. But mainly I was impressed by the fact that Obama, during his campaign and also so far in the administration, has placed the nuclear issue back in the forefront of our attention. The issue that Reagan and Gorbachev dealt with and I thought headed us in the right direction toward bringing nuclear weapons under control and even eliminating them as a final thing. So his espousal of that early on and the negotiations with Russia to bring that about give me encouragement. Also in other areas, it seemed to me that the Obama administration was taking a turn that was much more in accord with our interests than what the previous administrations had. For example, in the Middle East, where I think it is very clear that Israel will not be able to achieve security unless they stop the settlements and begin real negotiations. And clearly, that has been an issue also that the Obama administration has taken on.
You were a registered Democrat, but you had your most prominent foreign policy positions under two Republican presidents, Ronald Reagan and George Bush, first George Bush.
Yes.
It's also very clear from your book that you really admire Ronald Reagan.
Absolutely.
How did it happen that you became his foreign policy assistant advisor on all matters Russian? The reason I am asking is that you were a career foreign service officer. You were known as a pragmatist. You were a registered Democrat. And the image of Ronald Reagan was, well, he was an ideologue, the ultimate Cold Warrior. Why did he tend to you to have this very important position?
Well, first of all, my being a registered Democrat was irrelevant because I never considered foreign policy a partisan issue. Yes, I was considered very strong hardliner in dealing with the Soviet Union, but I also had lived there. I knew Russia, I knew the other nationalities, and I knew that Soviet ideology was not the whole story. And I found in Ronald Reagan a leader who understood how to deal with people, understood that you need to stay in communication, understood that if you're going to convince other people to do what you'd like them to do, you must convince them it's in their interest. So in working with Reagan, and I think he picked me probably because George Shultz recommended it, I was the most senior Foreign Service officer at that time who specialized in the Soviet Union. But I think he picked me because they knew that, number one, I was a hardliner in terms of dealing with the communist system, but also I knew Russia and I knew the country, and I sympathized with his desire to conduct negotiations that would change behavior.
It's a very interesting point. Came to office with a desire to change Soviet behavior.
Yes.
Today, a lot of historians, to say nothing about many conservatives, they claim that when Reagan came to the White House, he immediately wanted to destroy the Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire. Was it his objective?
No, I think that was not his objective. Obviously, he considered the Soviet Union an evil empire, that it had been, but when it began to change, and he was convinced it could be changed because much of their policies were not in their national interest. Once they began to change, he recognized that, and when he visited Moscow in May 1988, he was asked, is this still an evil empire? And he said, no, you know, that was in the past. And when he was asked then who is responsible for this change, he said, well, Mr. Gorbachev, of course. He's the leader of this country. So this clearly is his aim, and I think anyone who reads his memoirs, who reads the diaries that he wrote at the time, they've been published, recognizes that that had been his goal all along. He knew very well that you can't bring down a country by bringing pressure to bear, because if you bring nothing but pressure to bear without giving them a negotiating option, you strengthen the autocratic tendencies, you strengthen the nationalist tendencies. And so he was able to couch what we wanted in terms of cooperation and looking at things that we had common interests. And that, I think, was the essence of his diplomacy. Now, of course, we had to wait until you had Gorbachev to have a responsible Soviet leader. If we hadn't had Gorbachev, this might not have worked. But also, the hostile policies were not making the Soviet Union weaker. The Soviet Union's problems were internal. And by trying to change the external policies, we made it possible for Gorbachev, when he agreed, to think of internal reforms.
Ronald Reagan. Again, common perception is that he came to the office determined to launch a holy crusade against the Soviet Union. And he said a lot of things which at the time at least sounded pretty provocative. Evil empire stuff. Today, most people would agree with it, including probably even Russian leaders, but at that time it was quite controversial. Yet, you're telling in the book a fascinating story about President Reagan shortly after the assassination attempt, writing a handwritten note to Brezhnev against the advice of the State Department. Can you tell about that?
Yes, I think that shows his initial instinct was to reach out, to try to make human contact, to try to deal with the Soviet leaders as leaders who were not only communist ideologues, but also had the interests of their country at heart, if we could explain them. And of course, Brezhnev turned down that attempt. I'm not sure it was Brezhnev, I think it was Gromyko, the foreign minister, who seemed to control foreign policy in those last Brezhnev years. And so, but what then Reagan tried to do, and what he brought me on the staff to do, was to develop a strategy for dealing with the Soviet leaders. And in effect, he developed a strategy to emphasize cooperation, to emphasize common interests, and so that we were in place that when you got a reformer like Gorbachev, we already had our policies ready for that sort of Soviet leader.
So what you are saying, essentially, if I understand you correctly, is that Ronald Reagan had strong convictions. but he also was a result-oriented person, and that he was prepared to work with whomever was in power, even if that leader was as unattractive and inept as Leonid Brezhnev.